Every autumn, as the nights grow longer and the air turns cold, we carve pumpkins, light candles, and dress in costumes. But behind these familiar traditions lies a story much older, rooted in the fears and beliefs of medieval villagers. For them, Halloween was not about fun, it was about survival, about keeping away spirits and remembering the dead. Tonight, we'll go back to the Middle Ages and uncover the quiet, forgotten rituals that shaped the holiday we still know today. Stay with me, and together we'll walk slowly through the superstitions, prayers, and customs that made medieval Halloween both ordinary and extraordinary. Chapter 1. The Shadow of Samhain, from pagan roots to medieval rituals. When you think of Halloween today, you might picture carved pumpkins glowing on doorsteps, children in costumes moving from house to house, or bags of sweets and candies piling up at the end of the night. But if you close your eyes and allow yourself to drift back in time, you'll find that its origins are less about sweets and more about survival, superstition, and the rhythms of the medieval agricultural year. Let us begin far before the Middle Ages in the lands of the Celts, where the festival of Samhain marked the ending of summer and the arrival of winter's dark grip. The Celts, who lived across Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Britain, divided their year not into 4 seasons but into 2, the light half and the dark half. The transition into the dark half, beginning on the eve of October 31st, was seen as a dangerous moment, a time when the boundaries between the living and the dead grew thin. Fires were lit across hilltops to drive away evil spirits, and people gathered food in preparation for the long winter. When Christianity began to spread into these lands, missionaries quickly realized something. It was far easier to adapt and reshape existing traditions than to destroy them entirely. By the early medieval period, Samhain had not vanished but had instead been rebranded. November 1st became All Saints' Day, also known as All Hallows' Day, a day to honor the holy dead. The night before was therefore called All Hallows Eve, and in time, that name condensed into the Halloween we know today. But the medieval version of Halloween was far stranger, and in some ways far more unsettling than what we experience now. For medieval peasants, this time of year was not just symbolic, it was life and death. Crops had to be harvested in time, livestock had to be culled before winter, and people feared what might happen if spirits crossed too freely into their world. Imagine for a moment a medieval village in England around the 12th century. Air is cold, the harvest is over, and the fields are stubbled and brown. Families gather near the fire, their homes filled with the smell of dried herbs and stored grains. But outside, the night is filled with superstition. People believed the souls of the dead wandered during these days, and prayers, offerings, or even scraps of food might be left to guide or appease them. One custom that emerged in medieval Europe was known as souling. Poorer villagers would go door to door, offering prayers for the souls of the dead in exchange for food. Households often baked small round cakes called soul cakes, flavored with spices and marked with a cross. The act of giving these cakes wasn't just about charity, it was about ensuring that one's deceased loved ones received prayers in the afterlife. In a time when purgatory was a constant concern, such prayers were thought to shorten the suffering of souls between heaven and hell. The rich, of course, participated differently. In castles and manor houses, nobles would commission elaborate masses to be said for their ancestors. Wealth could buy prayers, and in medieval Europe, prayers were a form of currency just as much as coins or land. This difference between peasants knocking on doors for cakes and nobles endowing chapels for the salvation of their lineage reminds us how every tradition was shaped by class. But beyond prayers and cakes, the medieval imagination was filled with creatures that might emerge during this liminal time. Records from sermons, chronicles, and folktales describe fears of restless spirits, witches, and demons. The church often reinforced these fears, reminding people of the thin line between salvation and damnation. Yet in villages, older pagan echoes still survive stories of fairies or shapeshifters roaming the night, blending into the Christian framework of saints and devils. One particularly enduring superstition was the belief in the wild hunt. In parts of northern Europe, people believed that on stormy nights in autumn and winter, a spectral procession of hunters and hounds rode across the skies. To see it was a terrible omen, foretelling famine, war, or plague. It was thought to be most active during liminal times like All Hallows Eve. The sound of wind howling across the fields was enough to send villagers scurrying indoors, clutching charms or whispering prayers. The agricultural year also played into these beliefs. October and November were not only times of spiritual unease, but also times of practical necessity. Livestock that could not be fed through the winter were slaughtered, salted, and preserved. Fires burned not only for ritual, but also for warmth and survival. Food, after all, was at the heart of everything, storing it, blessing it, protecting it. In the medieval imagination, to let the dead wander hungry was to risk one's own supplies running dry. There's a quiet irony here. The peasants who feared spirits stealing their bread were themselves often hungry. Winters were lean, and famine was a constant threat. In some years, whole villages would find themselves stretched thin, surviving on pottage, a simple stew of oats, peas, and whatever vegetables could be spared. The souls of the dead might have been feared, but it was the hunger of the living that truly haunted these communities. Meanwhile, the church layered its own meanings onto these practices. By the 13th century, All Souls' Day, November 2nd, became an official feast, extending the focus beyond saints to ordinary departed souls. Priests reminded their congregations that offerings, prayers, and almsgiving could ease the suffering of loved ones in purgatory. This linked the older Samhain traditions of feeding spirits with Christian charity, weaving the two into one fabric. If you stood in a medieval church on All Saints or All Souls' Day, you would hear chants rising through cold stone walls, candles flickering, and bells tolling for the departed. Parishioners might leave with the faint smell of incense in their clothes, only to return home and encounter neighbors knocking on their doors, asking for cakes in exchange for prayers. Between the sacred and the everyday, the world of the living and the dead felt closely bound together. It is here, in these details, the cakes, the fires, the prayers, the fears, that we begin to see the real roots of Halloween as it was lived. In the Middle Ages, not as a single festival of costumes and pumpkins, but as a season of remembrance, superstition, and survival, yet a question lingers. For all the efforts of the church to Christianize the festival, how much of the old pagan Samhain truly remained in the minds of villagers? Were medieval people honoring saints, or were they still, in some quiet way, feeding the restless dead of older traditions? Chapter 2. Souling, Spirits, and the Fires of Autumn. Medieval Halloween in Daily Life. When you picture the late autumn nights of the Middle Ages, don't think of streets lined with glowing pumpkins, but of muddy lanes, the scent of wood smoke in the air, and villagers hurrying home before darkness settled in. As November approached, the church calendar dictated ritual after ritual, but beneath the surface of those observances was a rich layering of older folk traditions, quiet fears, and survival customs. One of the most striking practices of medieval Halloween was souling. On All Hallows Eve and into All Souls' Day, groups of the poor, often children, widows, or beggars, would move door to door in villages, offering to say prayers for the souls of a household's dead in exchange for food. The gift most often given was the small round soul cake, lightly spiced, often marked with a cross, and designed to be both sustenance and symbol. Each cake eaten was said to represent a soul freed from purgatory. The practice gave peasants a way to earn food during the lean months, but it also gave wealthier households a sense of religious duty fulfilled. Imagine the scene: a knock at the door, the cold autumn wind rushing in, and a thin child with ruddy cheeks whispering, "A soul cake, a soul cake." Pray you good mistress, a soul cake. A loaf or two might be passed out, along with the promise of prayers. The giver, in turn, believed their own departed kin might find rest sooner in the afterlife. This practice was not confined to the poorest. Even those with enough to eat might exchange cakes or ale with neighbors. It was a ritual of connection, where food, charity, and spiritual obligation intertwined. Yet it was also a reminder of the reality of class. A noble might purchase prayers by the hundreds through the founding of chantries or the endowing of monasteries, while a peasant might only hope that their few cakes and whispered prayers would make a difference. Souling, however, was not the only ritual of the season. Across Europe, bonfires blazed on hilltops and in village squares. The fires had practical uses. They provided warmth and light, and in some cases, they burned refuse left from the harvest. But their symbolic weight was far greater. In some regions, families carried embers from the communal fire back to their hearths, ensuring protection through the dark months. Sparks rising into the sky were said to carry prayers heavenward, while the fire itself was thought to repel wandering spirits. Children and youth sometimes played a more mischievous role. During these nights, some historians believe that certain forms of medieval mumming or guising, where villagers dressed in disguises and went door to door, may have been connected to these autumn festivals. Instead of the modern costume parade, think of a group of figures in rough masks of straw or cloth, their faces hidden, voices disguised, asking for food or ale. These disguises blurred the line between human and spirit, creating an atmosphere of unease. Were these truly neighbors at your door, or something else? The church, of course, was always aware of these popular customs. Preachers regularly warned against excess or superstition, urging people to focus on prayer, penance, and the holy remembrance of saints. Yet in practice, priests often tolerated or even participated in local traditions because they recognized that people needed both ritual and reassurance. After all, when you lived in a world where illness, famine, and early death were constant, the idea of the dead lingering close by was not an abstract metaphor. It was woven into daily life. Medieval people did not just fear spirits. They also sought to protect themselves with charms. Herbs like sage, rosemary, or rowan might be hung over doors. In some villages, lanterns carved from turnips were placed at windows or carried along lanes to ward off wandering souls. These lanterns, grimacing with crude faces, served both practical and supernatural purposes, lighting the way through dark paths and symbolically frightening off evil. Long before pumpkins became the face of Halloween, the turnip was the original guardian against the dark, but there was always suspicion too. Not every neighbor was trusted. In times of hardship, when cattle sickened or crops failed, whispers of witchcraft surfaced more easily around Halloween. The connection between women, herbs, and healing could turn suddenly into accusations of consorting with the devil. Though the great witch hunts would come centuries later, the seeds of suspicion were already in place in the medieval imagination. To see someone gathering herbs by moonlight near All Hallows Eve might be enough to stir unease. At the heart of these customs was something both simple and profound: the negotiation between life and death, community and isolation, the living and the departed. Families lit candles in windows not only to guide the souls of their own kin, but to prevent those same souls from wandering aimlessly, hungry and angry. Fires, food, cakes, disguises, all were ways of placing a boundary between what was known and what was feared. And while these practices might sound strange to you now, they were rooted in the rhythm of medieval life. Winter was long, cold, and dangerous. Mortality rates were high, and every family carried grief. Halloween, or rather, All Hallows Eve, was the moment when that grief was given structure, when fear could be expressed through ritual. It was boring in the sense that it was ordinary, repeated year after year. But for those who lived it, it was also essential. because it gave meaning to the uncertainties of their world. By the end of the 14th century, Europe had endured waves of plague, famine, and war. The sense of death lingering close at hand was stronger than ever. In churchyards, the new art of the danse macabre, or dance of death, showed skeletons leading kings, bishops, peasants, and merchants alike to the grave. This imagery reinforced what Halloween already embodied, that in death, all were equal, and that the boundary between the living and the dead was fragile. So the fires kept burning, the cakes were baked, the disguises were worn, and the prayers whispered. For peasants and lords alike, Halloween was less a celebration than a negotiation, a way to manage fear, to connect with community, and to hope, even briefly, that the souls of the departed were at peace. Yet as these practices deepened, so too did the question of control. Was Halloween truly about honoring the saints, or about appeasing spirits? Were people being faithful, or were they still quietly keeping alive the older ways of Samhain? Chapter 3. From Samhain to All Hallows: How Medieval Superstitions Shaped Modern Halloween. By the close of the medieval period, the customs surrounding All Hallows Eve had become firmly woven into the yearly rhythm of life across Europe. Yet, like a tapestry with threads from different eras, what we now think of as Halloween was never a single invention. It was a layered inheritance, fragments of pre-Christian ritual, medieval religious observance, and the ordinary habits of peasants trying to find comfort in a dark season. To understand how these elements survived, you must picture the slow evolution of daily life. Villagers in the 12th century did not imagine they were creating a future holiday. They were simply following the practices handed down to them, mixing older traditions with newer Christian ones. Over time, these small actions, lighting candles, baking soul cakes, wearing disguises, were repeated so consistently that they became cultural memory. One of the strongest threads tying the old to the new was the church calendar. By placing All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day in early November, the church ensured that the fading embers of Samhain, the Celtic festival of the dead, would not disappear, but instead be reshaped. What had once been a pagan recognition of the thinning boundary between worlds became a Christian period of prayer and remembrance. Yet the feeling of unease of spirits moving among the living remained. The act of souling, too, gradually took on new forms. In some regions, children no longer prayed only for the dead, but also performed small songs or verses in exchange for food or coins. This slow shift in practice would, centuries later, echo faintly in the custom of trick-or-treating. While medieval villagers would not have recognized today's Halloween streets filled with children in costumes, the principle of exchange and offering given for protection or favor was already in place. Even the lanterns carved from turnips held echoes of both worlds. To the medieval mind, carrying a lantern through the darkened countryside was both a practical act of light and a symbolic shield against spirits. Over time, this simple practice traveled with people, eventually transforming, especially in the New World, into the pumpkin lanterns that now define Halloween imagery. The leap from the bitter, hard turnip to the glowing, hallowed pumpkin was less about invention than adaptation. The imagery of death itself became sharper in the later Middle Ages. The danse macabre paintings, with skeletons leading popes and peasants alike, were not intended to frighten in the way modern horror does. Instead, they served as solemn reminders. Death spared no one. In this way, Halloween was not a carnival of fear, but a meditation on mortality. For the medieval villager, this message was not abstract. Graves were fresh, plague was remembered, and winter promised further loss. But alongside these solemn reminders was the human need for release. The disguises, the fires, and even the playful mischief of youths offered a chance to laugh at fear, to step outside of daily order, if only for a night. This tension between sacred ritual and mischievous revelry would carry forward into Later centuries, when Halloween would become both a night of prayer and a night of play, the church often walked a delicate line. In sermons, priests condemned excessive drinking, mocking disguises, or the whisper of witchcraft tied to Halloween. Yet they also relied on these very customs to bind communities together. Without them, the faithful might turn more fully back to older pagan practices. Tolerance was a practical necessity. By the time the medieval period ended, Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, was no longer just a single ritual, but a cluster of practices, prayers for the dead, both in churches and door-to-door, fires and lanterns lit to guide or ward off spirits, cakes baked, shared, and eaten in remembrance, disguises and mumming, blurring the line between the living and the dead. Each of these customs had its own meaning, yet together they formed a season where fear was managed through repetition. Ordinary people found reassurance in knowing that they had lit the proper candle, baked the proper cake, prayed the proper prayer. It was, in a way, boring. The same gestures performed each year. But in a world of constant uncertainty, boring. Rituals were the very fabric of survival. And when these customs eventually traveled, carried by migration, reshaped by new lands, they adapted again. The medieval soul cake became the ancestor of the sweet given to children. The bonfire became the backyard lantern. The disguises of straw and cloth became costumes of ghosts and witches. Even the unease at the heart of Halloween, that sense that the veil between worlds grows thin, remains, though now it is played out in stories, films, and decorated houses rather than whispered prayers in the dark. Yet one question lingers. For the medieval villager, these customs were not entertainment. They were necessities. Do we, in our modern Halloween celebrations, still carry something of that old fear of winter and death? Or have we turned a ritual of survival into nothing more than a night of play? Thank you for spending this quiet time with me, exploring the old superstitions and stories of Halloween in the Middle Ages. I hope the calm details helped you drift into rest, or simply enjoy a slower moment in your day. If you'd like more soft, sleepy history like this, please remember to like this video and subscribe to Quiet, Boring Sleep. It's a small way to support the channel, and it helps bring more of these gentle stories to life. Wishing you peace, warmth, and good rest until next time.